I want to tell you something before I start, and I need you to actually hear it. Not just process it the way you process news that doesn't apply to you, but actually sit with it. I put $455,000 into a restaurant in Chiang Mai. A restaurant with my tables, my kitchen equipment, my imported espresso machines, my hand-picked Burmese teak furniture, my wine collection, my custom signage designed by a graphic artist I hired from Melbourne, a restaurant that served food I helped develop the menu for, that was decorated with framed photographs I personally selected, that operated on systems and workflows I built from 30 years of running franchise operations across 3 states. A restaurant that, in every meaningful sense of the word, was mine, except legally. Legally, it never had my name on it. Not once. Not for a single day. And the woman who made sure of that is still running it right now with her new partner and her family, while I'm sitting in a rental apartment in Phoenix at 62 years old, wondering how a man who built and sold 2 successful restaurant chains somehow couldn't read the most basic warning signs in a business arrangement that, in hindsight, a high school student could have seen through. I'm telling you this so you understand what's possible. Not in an inspiring way, in a cautionary way. Because I was not a naive man. I was not desperate. I was not uneducated. I was the kind of man who other men came to for advice about money, about business, about risk management, and it still happened to me. That's the part I need you to understand first, before any of the rest of this makes sense. My name is Vincent, and this is what happened. I grew up in Tucson, Arizona, in a family that treated money the way some families treat religion, which is to say, with a combination of reverence and terror. My father worked maintenance for the county. My mother did alterations out of our kitchen. We weren't destitute, but we were careful. We ate everything on the plate. We wore clothes until they became something else. And I absorbed all of that, stored it somewhere in my chest, and turned it into fuel. By the time I was 30, I'd opened my first restaurant. By the time I was 42, I had a regional franchise operation with 11 locations across Arizona and Nevada. I understood margins. I understood leases. I understood the relationship between square footage and revenue per seat. I understood how to read a contract and how to tell when a handshake was worth less than the skin it was offered on. I want you to remember that when we get to the part where I handed over my savings to a woman I'd known for 14 months and signed documents I didn't fully read because she told me it was just how things worked in Thailand. I want you to remember that I knew better. That's what makes it so hard to explain, even now. That I knew better, and I did it anyway. The catalyst, since every story like this has one, was the sale of my second chain in September 2019. I'd spent 4 years building up a fast casual concept that I sold to a regional hospitality group for enough money to retire on, assuming I didn't do anything reckless with it. I was 59 at the time. My third marriage had ended the previous year, amicably enough, but still with the particular exhaustion that comes from recognizing a pattern in yourself that you haven't figured out how to break. I had a house in Scottsdale that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else's life. I had friends, good friends, but they were in the thick of careers and school runs and obligations that I no longer shared. I was free, technically, free in the way that a boat is free when its anchor chain snaps in open water. A colleague of mine, a man named Neil, who'd consulted on commercial kitchen design for one of my early locations and become a kind of peripheral friend over the years, had retired to Chiang Mai 3 years earlier. I'd seen his photographs on social media. I'd absorbed them the way you absorb something that seems like someone else's life until one day it doesn't. Mountains in the background. Streets full of color and food and noise. A pace that looked nothing like Phoenix in August. He sent me a message in November 2019 that said simply, "Come see for yourself." And I did. I arrived in Chiang Mai on a Wednesday morning in January 2020, about 6 weeks before the world locked down, which would turn out to be relevant in ways I didn't yet understand. Neil met me at the arrivals hall and drove me into the old city, through streets that were already warm and busy at 7 in the morning, past temples whose rooflines caught the early light in a way that made the whole city look like it was made of gold leaf. I remember thinking, somewhere in the taxi, that this was what retirement was supposed to feel like, not the Scottsdale model, which was essentially a slightly warmer version of working life but without the work. This was something different. I'm not going to romanticize it more than necessary because I think the romanticization was part of the problem, but I'll be honest and say that Chiang Mai hit me in a way I hadn't expected. Neil took me to a restaurant in the Niman area on my third evening there. It was a mid-size place, around 60 covers, Thai fusion concept, well-designed interior, clearly drawing an international crowd. The food was exceptional. The service was attentive without being obsequious. And the woman who came out to talk to Neil, who he apparently knew from the neighborhood, was Suta. She was 31, though I didn't know that yet. She was managing the front of house for that restaurant and had been, Neil told me later, for almost 4 years. She was professionally warm in a way that I recognized from my own years in hospitality, the kind of warmth that is a skill rather than a spontaneous gesture, but which doesn't feel manufactured because it's been practiced until it becomes genuine. She had the composure of someone who had learned to manage difficult situations and difficult people without showing the effort. I noticed all of this as professional observation, or I told myself I was. She spoke excellent English, better than most of the other staff I'd encountered, and she and Neil had a brief conversation about a wine supplier they apparently both dealt with. She refilled my water glass herself when she noticed it was empty. I noted the care in that detail, the attentiveness, the way a good manager notices what a guest needs before the guest notices it themselves. I didn't think, walking out of that restaurant that night, that she would be central to the worst financial decision of my life. I thought she was impressive. I thought the restaurant was impressive. I thought Chiang Mai was impressive. And I flew home to Scottsdale 2 weeks later, thinking about all three of them in roughly equal measure. The world shut down in March. The sale money from my chain sat in various accounts. I found myself, like a great many people, with an unusual amount of time and an unusual amount of introspection. Neil and I spoke regularly on video calls. He talked about Chiang Mai with the slightly evangelical certainty of a convert. He mentioned Suta occasionally, not as a romantic proposition, just as someone he knew in the neighborhood who he thought I'd find interesting professionally. She'd been trying, apparently, to open her own place for years. She had the concept, the connections, the management experience. What she didn't have was capital. I remember when I registered that detail. I registered it and filed it under interesting, not under warning, which tells you something about my state of mind at the time. I was 59, recently divested of my professional identity, recently untethered from a marriage, sitting alone in a house in Scottsdale in a global pandemic. The idea of someone with vision and no capital was not a threat. It was, in the particular vocabulary of the man I'd always been, an opportunity. We started talking on video calls in April 2020, Suta and I, not about the restaurant at first, just about industry talk, supply chain disruptions, how the hospitality sector was going to look on the other side of the lockdowns. She was sharp. Specifically sharp in the way that people who've spent years managing real operations are sharp, not theoretically smart but practically intelligent, full of specific examples and concrete observations. She talked about the restaurant she worked for with the measured dissatisfaction of someone who'd outgrown their situation. She talked about the concept she developed with the precise, iterated language of someone who'd been refining it for a long time. A modern, northern Thai restaurant, she said. Not tourist food. Not the same pad Thai and green curry that every place in the old city served. Proper Lana cuisine, the kind her grandmother made, elevated for a contemporary dining room. Local ingredients from farmers she already had relationships with. A wine program that took northern Thai flavors seriously enough to pair them thoughtfully. She'd done the costing. She'd identified a property. She'd mapped the staffing structure. What she didn't have, and what she said this with a kind of careful restraint that I found dignified rather than strategic, was the initial capital to make it real. I know what you're thinking, and you're right. But let me walk you through the inside of my head at that moment, because I think it matters. I wasn't thinking about a rescue narrative. I wasn't thinking about buying affection or companionship. I was thinking about the fact that I had spent 30 years in restaurants and this woman clearly understood restaurants. I was thinking that the post-pandemic hospitality landscape was going to reward exactly the kind of differentiated, experience-led concept she was describing. I was thinking about what a 60% share in a well-run Chiang Mai restaurant might return over 5 years. I was, in other words, thinking like a businessman. Or I was telling myself I was. Looking back now, sitting here in Phoenix, in the particular silence of a rented apartment, I can see the other thing I was doing, but I wasn't ready to see it then. I flew back to Chiang Mai in October 2020, when international travel had become possible again in a patchy and complicated way. Neil met me at the airport again. Suta met me for dinner on my second night, at a small place near the old city walls that she said was her favorite restaurant in Chiang Mai outside of where she worked. I remember the evening clearly. The air had that particular warmth that Chiang Mai has in October, still hot but with something autumnal beginning at the edges of it. The food was extraordinary. She'd ordered for both of us without asking, which I noticed, and everything she chose was correct, which I also noticed. We talked for 3 hours. By the end of the evening, I'd agreed, in principle, to look at the property she'd identified for the restaurant. The property was in the Nominee area, a commercial space that had previously been a gallery and had the kind of bones that restaurant designers dream about. High ceilings, exposed brick, a rear courtyard that could seat another 20 covers under the right conditions. The asking price for a long-term lease was, in Thai commercial real estate terms, reasonable. The build-out she'd costed was thorough and detailed, presented in a folder that she handed me at the property viewing with the calm efficiency of someone who had been preparing it for a long time. I went through it in the car afterward with Neil, who had come along as what he called moral support, and what I suspected was mild surveillance on behalf of his own curiosity. Neil said, carefully, that Chiang Mai was a market he knew well and that the location was good. He said the concept was strong. He also said, and I remember this with the particular precision that hindsight grants to words you wish you'd weighted differently at the time, that he'd seen a few foreigners go into hospitality partnerships in Thailand and that the legal structures could be complicated. He said it the way you say something when you don't want to be the person who said the obvious thing but you feel obligated to say it anyway. I heard it. I told him I understood Thai foreign business laws, that I'd done research, that I wasn't planning to simply hand over money without proper structures in place. I said this with the confidence of a man who had built and sold 2 restaurant chains. I said it as if professional competence in one context automatically transferred to every other context. That was the flaw. That was the precise crack in my thinking that everything else eventually poured through. Over the following 2 months, the relationship between Suta and me shifted. It didn't shift dramatically or suddenly. It shifted the way the light shifts in late afternoon, gradually enough that you don't mark the moment of change, you just find yourself at a different point than you were. She was attentive in the way that good hospitality professionals are attentive, which meant it was difficult to know where professional warmth ended and personal interest began. I told myself I wasn't confusing the two. I was wrong about that, but not in the way you might be imagining. It wasn't infatuation that clouded my judgment, or not primarily. It was something subtler. It was the feeling of being relevant again, of being in the middle of something that mattered, of being consulted, deferred to, valued for the specific thing I'd spent my life building. After a year of Scottsdale silence and pandemic stillness, that feeling was more powerful than I'd admitted to myself. By December 2020, I had agreed to fund the restaurant. The arrangement, as we discussed it, was a partnership. I would provide the capital. She would provide the operational expertise, the local relationships, the cultural knowledge. I would hold a 60% interest in the business. She would hold 40% and draw a management salary. We would register the business in Thailand through the appropriate legal channels. I want to pause here and tell you about the documents, because this is where the phantom begins, where the ownership I thought I had started existing only in my imagination. Thai law does not allow foreign nationals to own majority shares in most Thai businesses. I knew this in the abstract. What I didn't know, or rather what I didn't pursue with the rigor I should have, was what the practical alternatives looked like. Suta introduced me to a lawyer, a man with an office near Promenade Mall whose suits were too large for his frame but whose manner was professionally reassuring. He explained in careful English that there were structures available, Thai limited companies with nominee shareholders, board structures that gave the foreign investor effective control. He produced documents. I spent an evening reading them, which I now recognize as a sentence that contains within it the entire story of my failure, because reading documents you don't fully understand and finding nothing obviously alarming is not the same as having protection. The lawyer told me that everything was in order. Suta translated the parts that needed translating, which was most of the Thai text, and I signed. What I signed was a structure in which Suta held the business registration and the operating license. What I was told I had was a contractual interest in the profits and a director's agreement that would, in theory, give me oversight. What I actually had, as I would eventually discover, was approximately nothing enforceable. The build-out began in February 2021. I was there for most of it. I want to be clear about this because I think it matters to understanding how complete the fiction was. I was on site. I was making decisions. I was sourcing equipment, negotiating with suppliers, reviewing the kitchen layout with the contractor. I flew in a commercial kitchen consultant I'd used in my previous operations, a woman named Jan, who charged $2,000 a day and was worth every cent, and her recommendations were implemented with Suta's full cooperation. I tasted dishes in development in Suta's apartment kitchen on Sunday evenings, making notes in the same style I'd used in 30 years of menu development. I met the farmers who would supply the restaurant and shook their hands and looked them in the eyes. I ordered 700,000 baht worth of kitchen equipment, which at the exchange rate at the time was roughly $17,000. I ordered furniture, tableware, and a wine cellar. I transferred money in tranches from my U.S. accounts to a Thai bank account that had been set up in Suta's name because, as she and the lawyer both explained, a foreign national could not hold a Thai commercial bank account without a work permit. The logic seemed sound. Everything seemed sound. The whole structure was designed to seem sound. By the time the restaurant opened in June 2021, I had invested approximately $230,000 in the build-out equipment and pre-opening working capital. The restaurant was beautiful. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. It was genuinely, carefully beautiful in a way that only happens when someone with real aesthetic sensibility and real operational intelligence is involved. The dining room held 64 covers. The courtyard was usable in the evenings, adding another 28. The menu was everything Suta had described, traditional Lana dishes executed with a kind of precision and care that made them feel like discoveries rather than reconstructions. The opening night was full. The second night was full. The reviews on the platforms that mattered were immediately, enthusiastically positive. TripAdvisor, Google, a food blogger based in Bangkok who had 30,000 followers and who wrote about the restaurant with a warmth that produced a visible spike in reservation requests the following week. I felt in those first weeks the particular satisfaction that I associated with the early life of a good restaurant, the energy of a room that's found its pace, the small adjustments and course corrections of opening weeks solidifying into operational routine. I was involved in every part of it. I was there for the briefings before dinner service. I was there for the post-service reviews. I was, in every functional sense, the co-owner of this place, except legally, except in any way that mattered when things started to change. The first thing I noticed, around September 2021, was the financial reporting. When I'd first arrived in Thailand and we'd been in the planning stages, Suta had provided detailed projections, month by month, cover by cover, with margin assumptions that I'd reviewed and adjusted and approved. After opening, the reporting became less regular. A summary, a rough accounting of covers and average spend. When I asked for the underlying numbers, the daily sales reports, the cost of goods reconciliation, I got versions of the answer that were responsive without being informative. She was busy. The system was being set up. The accountant was behind. There was always a version of this answer ready, and each version was plausible in isolation. It was only in aggregate, months later, that the pattern became visible. I noticed, around the same time, that Suta's relationship with me had shifted in a way I struggled to precisely locate. She was still professionally collegial. She was still attentive to details. But something in the texture of our interactions had changed, something in the register of her attention. She was less curious about my observations. She was less interested in my input. Decisions that had previously been collaborative were now presented to me as fait accompli, with explanations that were offered in the tone of a report rather than a discussion. When I raised this, gently, she said I was overthinking, that she was just busy, that running a restaurant at this level required focus, and she couldn't always slow down to explain every decision to me. I heard that as reasonable. I told myself I was being that particular kind of insecure that comes from being too much in your own head. I had, after all, stepped back from operational involvement in my own restaurants eventually. This was her restaurant, in the way that mattered day to day. I was the capital partner. I needed to respect that division. The emergency began with her mother. In November 2021, Suta told me that her mother, who lived in a village outside Chiang Mai, had been diagnosed with something she described as a heart condition requiring urgent treatment. She named a private hospital. She named a figure, 380,000 baht, which, at the prevailing exchange rate, was around $11,000. She said her family had some of it, but not all of it. She said she was sorry to ask. She said it only once, with a straightforwardness that I found disarming precisely because it wasn't phrased as a request so much as a disclosure of circumstances. I thought about it for less than 20 minutes and transferred the money. Her mother recovered well, apparently. I met her once, in December, at a family gathering to which I was invited with the warmth that Thai families can extend to Farang when they choose to. She was a small woman who brought me too much food and spoke no English and patted my hand in a way that I found genuinely touching. I thought about the hospital money and felt briefly good about it. That's important too. The feeling of having done something that mattered. of being needed in a way that had nothing to do with my professional identity. I stored that feeling, and it became part of the reason I was slow to question what came next. What came next was a series of smaller emergencies with the cadence of a tide coming in. Her brother's motorbike shop had a difficult quarter, and he needed 60,000 baht to cover a supplier debt. Her sister's youngest had a problem at school requiring fees for special support. A cousin who'd been a sort of informal sous chef in the early days of the restaurant needed dental surgery. Each amount was reasonable in isolation. Each story was plausible and specific. I transferred the money for each one, in most cases without being formally asked, because by then I'd absorbed the rhythm of these requests, and it was easier to respond to them than to examine them. I remember, in the spring of 2022, having a conversation with Neil that I think of now as the moment I had the information I needed and chose not to use it. We were eating at a small noodle place near the Ping River, and Neil asked carefully how the restaurant was going. I told him it was going well, that we were trading strongly, that the concept had found its audience. He nodded. He asked if I was getting regular financial reporting. I said the reporting was a work in progress. He said, still carefully, that he'd heard from someone in the Niman restaurant community that the place had changed its banking arrangements. I asked what he meant. He said he wasn't entirely sure, that it was just something someone had mentioned, that he might have the details wrong. I went back to my apartment that afternoon and told myself that Neil's information was second-hand and imprecise and probably nothing. I told myself that I was in a functional, if slightly reduced, role in the restaurant's management, and that the financial irregularities I'd noticed were the kind of growing pain that happened in the first year of any operation. I told myself that I knew how restaurants worked, and I knew when something was genuinely wrong versus when something was in a phase of normalization. I was a man standing on a beach, watching the water pull away from the shore, thinking, "This is interesting," rather than turning and running. By the summer of 2022, I had invested an additional $140,000 in what Suta described as expansion costs. A private dining room added to the courtyard space, a new POS system, a rebrand and marketing push after a competitor opened nearby. Each expenditure had a justification and a supporting rationale. Some of them, I believe now, were genuine. Some of them were something else. The precise ratio I'll never fully know. The discovery came in September 2022 through a method that, in retrospect, has the character of something obvious that was always there, waiting to be seen. I had been trying, for several months, to obtain a copy of the company registration documents because I needed them for a U.S. tax filing that my accountant in Phoenix was preparing. The documents I had from the original incorporation were, my accountant noted, incomplete. She needed the full Thai company registration certificate, the list of directors and shareholders as currently registered, and a translated summary of the operating agreements. Suta provided a set of documents which I sent to my accountant, who sent them to a Thai legal specialist she used for international clients. The specialist came back within a week with a response that my accountant forwarded to me with a message that said, "I think you need to call me today, not tomorrow, today." I remember where I was when I read that email. I was sitting in the restaurant's office, a small room behind the kitchen that smelled of citrus and stock and the particular warmth of a working commercial kitchen. It was mid-afternoon, and the prep team was working on the other side of the wall. I could hear the rhythm of knife work and the distant sound of someone singing along to something on a phone. I read the email 3 times before I called my accountant. The documents Suta had provided showed a company structure in which she was the sole registered director and sole registered shareholder. Not 40%, 100%. The agreement I had signed in 2021, the one that the lawyer in Chiang Mai had prepared and I had spent an evening reading, was a profit-sharing agreement between myself and the company. Not a shareholding agreement, not an ownership agreement. A profit-sharing agreement which in Thailand, as the specialist explained on the call I had with her 2 days later, carried no legal weight as a claim to business assets and would not, in the event of any dispute, be recognized by a Thai court as conferring any ownership interest in the company. The company was Suta's. The operating license was in her name. The bank accounts were in the company's name, which meant her name. The lease on the property was held by the company. Every asset I had created with my money was legally hers. I closed the laptop. I remember closing the laptop very carefully, as if the care in the movement might contain what was happening. There was a sound from the kitchen, something metal clattering against something else metal, and then a burst of laughter from one of the prep cooks. I sat very still for what might have been 5 minutes or 20 minutes. I was wearing, I noticed, a shirt that I'd bought at a market in the old city in my first week in Chiang Mai, a pale blue linen thing that I'd paid 200 baht for and which I'd worn constantly because it was comfortable and light and reminded me of the ease I'd felt arriving here. I thought about that ease. I thought about how much I'd wanted it to be real. The confrontation happened that evening. I asked Suta to come to the office after service. I showed her the specialist's email. I showed her the company registration documents. I asked her, in a voice I was trying to keep level, to explain the difference between what we had agreed and what the documents showed. Her initial response was that I didn't understand Thai business structure, that the documents were standard, that my profit-sharing agreement was the real protection, the real document that mattered. She said this with the particular composure of someone who has prepared for this conversation. I asked if she had known, when we set up the structure, that my agreement had no legal weight as a claim to ownership. There was a pause before she answered that. A short pause, but I'd spent 30 years in rooms where decisions were made, and I could feel the weight of what was happening inside it. She said that Thai law was complicated. She said that the lawyer had explained everything at the time. She said I had signed what I signed, and she couldn't be responsible for whether I understood documents before signing them. The rage I felt in that moment was a cold thing. Not the hot rage of a confrontation, but the cold rage of someone who has just been told, by implication, that they were a fool and that their foolishness was their own problem. I asked about the bank accounts. I asked about the financial reporting I'd been waiting for since September 2021. I asked about the $140,000 in expansion costs. She said the expansion costs were necessary for the business's survival. She said the business's books were accurate and available if I wanted to see them, but that they were the company's books, which meant they were hers to share at her discretion as the director. I left the restaurant that night and walked back to my apartment through the Niman streets that I had spent 2 years learning as if they were my own. A street vendor was selling khao niao mamwang from a cart at the corner I always passed, and the smell of mango and coconut milk hit me as it always did, and I felt, in that particular combination of fury and grief, something break loose in my chest that I didn't know how to name. I engaged a Thai lawyer the following week, a different one, a woman in Chiang Mai who came, recommended by the Canadian owner of an expat-oriented business that I'd met through Neil. She reviewed my documents over 48 hours and then sat across from me at a glass conference table and told me, with the professional gentleness of someone delivering a medical diagnosis, that my legal position was effectively non-existent. The profit-sharing agreement was unenforceable as a claim to the business. I had no standing as a director because I'd never been registered as one, despite what the agreement appeared to suggest. My investment was, from a legal standpoint, a series of loans to a Thai company, loans for which I had no collateral and no registered interest. She said I could pursue the matter in a Thai court, but that the costs would be substantial, the timeline would be measured in years, and the outcome was deeply uncertain. She said she would take the case if I wanted to proceed, but she wanted me to understand clearly what I was choosing. I asked her what she would do in my position. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I would cut my losses and go home." I sat with the full accounting in my hotel room that night, which was the room I'd moved to after leaving the apartment, in the same building where I'd lived for almost 2 years, but suddenly an absurd place to be sleeping given what I now knew. I went through every transfer, every cash payment, every piece of equipment I'd purchased, every family emergency I'd funded. The restaurant build-out and equipment came to $231,000. The expansion costs, which I could now see had partially involved equipment that appeared on no invoice Suta had ever shown me, came to $142,000. The family emergencies, tallied in sequence for the first time in full, came to approximately $68,000. The operating capital I'd transferred in the early months of the restaurant's life, when cash flow was building, came to $14,000. Total losses, $455,000, not $450,000, not approximately $460,000, $455,000. I am 62 years old. I will not earn this back. That is not a dramatic statement or an exercise in self-pity. It is the arithmetic of being 62 with no active business and a retirement account that has been raided and a rental apartment in Phoenix that costs $1,200 a month. It is the arithmetic that I sit with every morning when I wake up. Neil came to see me before I left. He sat across from me in the lobby of the hotel with his hands around a coffee and said, very quietly, that he was sorry. He didn't say he'd tried to warn me. He had the decency not to. He just said he was sorry, and that he wished things had gone differently, and that he'd said what he'd said at the noodle place because he was worried, and he hoped I didn't blame him for not having said more. I told him I didn't blame him. I told him I'd been the kind of man who doesn't hear warnings because he's decided he's the exception, and that's not the kind of man who can be helped by a warning over noodles. I left Chiang Mai in October 2022. I took a single bag. Everything else was either in the restaurant or in an apartment that I'd walked away from because the lease naturally was in Suta's name. At the airport, waiting for my flight to Bangkok and then to Los Angeles, I sat by a window in the departure hall and watched aircraft move on the tarmac in the thick tropical morning and thought about nothing in particular for a long time. I had been for 2 years a man with a purpose in a place that felt like it had chosen him. I was leaving without the purpose and with the feeling, which has not entirely left me even now, that the place had simply finished with me. The restaurant, as of the last time I checked, is still open, still well reviewed. Suta runs it with a man who, from his social media presence, appears to be a Belgian national who works in regional development. He is, based on his photographs, approximately 10 years younger than me. I hope, in the specific way that you hope for things you can't look at directly, that he has his name on the paperwork. Here is what I know now that I didn't know then. Or rather, here is what I knew and didn't let myself apply. Thai foreign business law is not a technicality. It is the operating environment. Every piece of paperwork you sign in a Thai commercial context is the operating environment. The emotional relationship you have with the person across the table from you when you sign it is irrelevant to what the document actually says, and what the document actually says is all that will matter if the relationship changes. I had 30 years of experience in commercial real estate, franchise agreements, supply contracts, and operating leases. I read contracts. That was not the problem. The problem was that I believed the contracts I was being shown were the real ones, that the lawyer Suta introduced me to was working in my interest, that the structure being proposed was the standard structure for my situation rather than a structure designed for her situation. The problem was that I trusted the interpreter of the documents more than the documents themselves, and the interpreter had a different agenda than the one she presented. But I'm going to say something harder than that, because I think stopping at the external explanation is its own kind of dishonesty. I was a man who was 60 years old and recently untethered from everything that had defined him, who had found, in a beautiful city in northern Thailand, a version of purpose and relevance and connection that felt better than anything he'd had in years. I wanted that to be real. I wanted it badly enough that I applied my professional intelligence selectively, which is to say, I used it in the areas where using it didn't threaten the thing I wanted and set it aside in the areas where using it honestly would have required me to question the thing I wanted. That is not Sutita's failure. That is mine. If you are a man of a certain age, considering a business partnership in Thailand with a Thai national, and if the capital structure requires the business to be registered in her name because of legal requirements, I am asking you to hear what I'm about to say at the level that actually applies to your situation, not the level where it seems like advice for someone else. There is no legal structure in Thailand that puts your money into a business you don't legally own that protects you adequately. There are structures that appear to protect you. There are lawyers who will assure you that the structure protects you. There are partners who will tell you with complete sincerity that the structure protects you. None of this is the same as actually being protected. If you cannot own the business legally, in your name, in a way that a Thai court would recognize as giving you an ownership claim, then you are not a business partner. You are a lender with no security interest and no collateral, which is another way of saying you are someone who has given money away. I know how this sounds. I know it sounds like obvious advice that only a fool would need. I was not a fool. I was a man who wanted something badly enough to make the obvious advice feel like it applied to other people. That's the mechanism. That's the whole mechanism. The financial structure was the weapon. But the wanting was the vulnerability. I'm writing this from Phoenix. It's late in the evening, and the air outside is the dry desert heat that I grew up with and then left, and now live inside again, which is perhaps its own kind of conclusion. I have a part-time consulting arrangement with a hospitality group that knows my work and was kind enough to create something for me when I came back with nothing. I have friends who didn't say they told me so, which I'll be grateful for until I die. I have, in the specific sense that seems relevant here, the story that's the dark humor of it. I lost $455,000, and what I have to show for it is a story. I'll spend whatever time I have left making sure it's worth something to someone who needed to hear it before they made the same mistake. That will have to be enough, because it's what there is. I didn't go back to Thailand. I don't plan to, not because I hate it. I don't hate it. I went there full of something, and the fullness was real even if the thing that caused it turned out not to be. The mountains were still there. The food was still extraordinary. The morning light on the temple rooftops was still exactly what it had been the first day I saw it. None of that was a lie. The only thing that was a lie was the part I built on top of it. That was the part that was always going to collapse. I just hadn't figured out yet that I was the one who'd built it.